The Telegraph will be back with you a little later, but those reports certainly suggesting that Rwanda plan, but as Ian was saying, there's not much to kill off right now. It never took off, but the suggestion that one of the first moves by Keir Starmer has been to put an end to that Rwanda plan. We also talked there about reform gaining seats, and we've been following all sorts of developments, but the movements particularly of the new government today, Keir Starmer meeting the King, of course, announcing his cabinet. But of course, some would also argue that it's important to consider now what is the official opposition. Who will hold the government to account? The much depleted Conservative Party, of course, will be in opposition, but are they in any position to hold Labour to account? And what does it look like with so few MPs? Are the Conservatives up to the task? The Liberal Democrats, of course, now returning to Westminster as the third largest party. So let's talk about life in opposition with Dr. Nigel Fletcher. He's a political historian at King's College in London and co-founder of the Centre for Opposition Studies. Good to have you with us on the programme. And it's an interesting area, this, isn't it? Because suddenly the opposition party find themselves in power and they've got to make good on all those promises. Talk to me about going the other way. The Conservatives suddenly finding that from having the keys to number 10, they're now in opposition and they've got to sort of gather and regroup if they're to prove to be an effective opposition.
Yes, indeed. I mean, obviously today we're focused very much on the transition to government and the flurry of activity that we'll see now from Keir Starmer as the new Prime Minister, the new cabinet, and so on. But I think, the Conservatives, having been in office for 14 years, are going to be having something of a culture shock. We saw this in 1997 after they'd been in power for 18 years. And when they suddenly crashed into opposition, they really didn't know what they were doing. And in some ways, they were in a better position then. They had more MPs than they've got today. And the rest of the sort of political picture was, in some ways, slightly more favourable to them. They didn't have the Reform Party there sort of snapping at their heels and putting pressure on them on that side. And so the Conservatives today going into opposition, they've got huge political problems, but they'll soon realise that the first problems they've got, like any opposition when it starts going into opposition, is the logistical problem of how to actually organise themselves. They've spent 14 years in government being supported by the officials and by the civil service, and now there's nothing. They'll go in to Parliament on Monday. They'll have to try and find their way to the opposition offices. Rishi Sunak is now the leader of the opposition, and he'll have to assemble some kind of staff for the interim period that he's doing that in order to start holding the government to account. And there's no real experience on his side of doing that. So it's a really difficult task. And one that they will have to get to grips with, whilst frankly, most people aren't interested in anything they have to say. The first thing an opposition really discovers is that actually everyone is talking about government, everyone's interested, as you were talking to Ian Watson there about the Rwanda plan and how that's being ditched and new initiatives that the government is putting in to sort of change things that the previous government has done. Wes Streeting sort of coming out with a flurry of activity as well. All of those things happening are exciting, and the opposition and what the Tories are up to really isn't of much interest to anyone, which will come as a bit of a surprise to some of them.
Do you expect there will be much sympathy across the country right now that the Conservatives find themselves in a position not only having to regroup and work out what went wrong, they lost some senior players, some big names in their party who lost their seats last night, and at the same time they've found themselves really vulnerable to that rise of the Reform Party. And Nigel Farage and those 5 seats, he says he's got others in his sight, really splitting the vote for the Conservatives last night. And it strikes me they face a battle on 2, if not more fronts, just regrouping and reforming as a party and establishing who and what they are, and with, one assumes, some relatively inexperienced people who will take up those jobs, but at the same time to determine how to fend off a threat from Nigel Farage and the Reform Party.
Absolutely. As I say, one of the main things they have to contend with is the logistical problems of being in opposition. It's not a very comfortable experience. But then there is this political challenge. How do you rebuild your party? How do you try to mount a credible challenge as an alternative? What is your strategy going to be? And the usual thing that happens to an opposition when it first goes into opposition, a party will tend to argue amongst itself for a long time. They'll have the leadership election where there will be contested views of what they should be doing. And for the Conservative Party at the moment, it is really unclear as to what they can do. There will be an argument between one side that will say they need to take on Reform UK and to challenge Nigel Farage on the one hand and beat him. And then there'll be people on the other side, we've already seen some people saying this, that they need to somehow form an alliance with Reform UK and bring those voters back on side. Now, there are two very different strategies there, and there's going to be a heck of an argument between those sides of the Conservative Party about what to do about Nigel Farage and Reform UK. That's going to be one challenge, at the same time as they've got to try and work out how they recover all of those voters that they've lost to Labour and to the Liberal Democrats. So it's a political problem, it's a strategic problem, and I think that they will be arguing for some time about how they address that. And that's on top of all of the things they've got to do to rebuild their party organisation. They'll have demoralised troops. Their activists will be feeling pretty bloodied by this result. They will have lost personnel. I mean, losing all of those MPs and losing all of those seats means that in those areas they will struggle to mount a campaign locally as well. There's a whole range of institutional things that go with having MPs and having that size in the House of Commons that they don't have. I mean, even simple things like being able to directly shadow government departments. Do they have enough MPs to do that? All of these are practical problems, but they sit alongside all of these longer-term strategic problems that are going to be the subject of quite a lot of argument before they're able to come to some kind of view about how they're going to get themselves out of this historically large hole that they've dug for themselves.
What does effective opposition look like? And the reason I ask is that, when the polls predicted this massive majority for Labour, Rishi Sunak said that there was a danger to democracy of handing any party such a majority. But then if you actually look at what transpired last night, yes, a huge landslide, a majority for Labour, but on just 35% of the vote. And so therefore I wonder where the opposition comes in and the role that opposition plays in holding government to account, a government that got 35% of the vote.
Indeed, and it's one of the reasons I think that studying opposition is so important. Under the first past the post system that we have for parliamentary elections, it's been a very long time since any government won office on over 50% of the vote. Most governments in the post-war period have won power on the basis of a minority of votes cast in the election. So in some ways, I always say that opposition is not just half of the argument, it's more than half of the argument, because most people have voted for opposition parties, if you break it down in that way. But yes, I think it is something that the Conservatives will be looking at with, if there's any crumbs of comfort for them in attacking Labour in the years to come, it will be that there has been quite a low vote share for Labour, but it's a bit difficult for them to take much comfort for that when theirs is even lower than that. But it does make the point that that opposition is a large part of the political equation, whoever is doing it. But in this situation, as you say, Labour have won barely more than a third of the votes, and they have something like 2/3 of the seats. So I think we'll see some people who are in favour of proportional representation redoubling those calls. The Conservative Party has suffered from that, and I think they will also be looking at this and wondering whether this is something that they can use as an attack on Labour as being a government with a huge majority that is not I suppose in their imagination is not earned, is not deserved. But it is a problem. I mean, however it's arrived at, do have this massive majority, and a Conservative Party that is so much smaller, they're going to be massively outnumbered in the division lobbies, they're going to be massively outnumbered in the chamber, and just the sort of feeling of that, when they walk in on Tuesday of next week, those MPs survive, will find that they are feeling very, very much more sparse than they are used to.
Dr. Nigel Fletcher, good to have you with us, political historian there at King's College London. Thank you.